In this section we are going to understand what is float. So before getting into that, let's just have a look at the diagram, this network diagram which we were using in the past sessions. Here this critical path is shown with two lines, right? That is, your critical path here is 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 5 and 5 to 6. So here if you observe, this critical path has E and L, that is the earliest start and finish time and the latest start and finish time, and this one also we have prepared in table, right? So we have prepared in table. Now we'll just mark those activities which are very critical. The activities which are critical are 1 to 2. I'll highlight here. They are 1 to 2, then 2 to 4, then 4 to 5 and 5 to 6. 4 to 5 and 5 to 6. Here if you know that every critical activity in a network, okay, they have earliest start time and they also have latest start time. If you note the earliest start time and latest start time of all activities, they'll be differing at some point. For example, if you note here, for the activity 2 to 3, earliest start time is 6, whereas for the latest start time it is 8. And here if you note for 3 to 4, earliest start time is 14, whereas latest start time is 16. So it is differing. But the point you have to note here is that the earliest start time and latest start time for critical activities are same. Please have a look at here. The earliest start time is 0, latest start time is 0 for the critical activity 1 to 2. Then you have 2 to 4, earliest start time is 6, latest start time is 6. Then you have 4 to 5, earliest start time is 16, latest start time is 16, and you have 5 to 6, earliest start time is 36 and the latest start time is 36. So here what you have to observe is that in critical activity or in a network which has critical activities, the earliest start and the latest start time are same. This is because the critical activities cannot be scheduled later than their earliest schedule. That is, you have the latest schedule, right? And you also have the earliest schedule. In critical activities, you cannot schedule those activities later than the earliest schedule. That's more important. This is the point. In critical activities, or the critical activities cannot be scheduled later than the earliest schedule time without delaying the total project duration. Okay, but you cannot delay the project duration, right, for these purposes. So you don't have flexibility in changing the time of critical activities. However, the non-critical activities like this 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 3 to 5, which are non-critical activity, they do have some flexibilities. It means these activities can be delayed for some time without affecting the total project duration. And this flexibility, what you have, right, this flexibility is called as slack. This term slack is used, I mean this flexibility in time, for that we use the term slack for referring to flexibility in events. And if you have flexibility in timing of an activity, okay, if you have flexibility in timing of an activity, it will be called as float. So let me put it here. If you are going to have flexibility in terms of event, it is going to be called as slack. And if you are going to have flexibility in terms of activity, it is going to be called as float, right? So there are various aspects or various methods have to be understood with regard to these items. So let's first understand what is this slack time for an event. We are talking in terms of flexibility. So what is this slack time for an event? What is the slack time for an event? The slack time or slack of an event in a network is nothing but the difference between the latest event time and the earliest event time. Okay, so I'll put it as Li and Ei. So it is nothing but a difference between the latest event time and earliest event time, and if you want me to put it mathematically, then it can be Li minus Ei. So here the Li stands for latest allowable occurrence time. It is latest allowable occurrence time, and Ei stands for earliest allowable occurrence time. So this is the slack of an event. Then we should also understand what is total float of an activity. What is total float of an activity? See, the total float of an activity is nothing but the difference between the earliest. It is nothing but the difference between the earliest and the latest allowable start or finish times. So this total float of an activity is nothing but the difference between the earliest and the latest allowable start or finish times for the activity. So if you want me to give it in the formula, then it can be expressed like this: total float of an activity I to j is nothing but the difference between the latest start time and earliest start time. Okay, it is LST, latest start time minus earliest start time, or it can also be expressed as say total float time for the activity I to j is equal to latest finish time minus earliest finish time. So it is nothing but the difference between the maximum time available for the activity and the actual time it takes to complete. So the total floats indicates the amount of time by which actual completion of an activity can exceed its earliest expected completion time without causing any delay in the project duration. The next technical aspect what we have to understand is free float. So what is this free float? Free float is nothing but the portion of total float. Already we have calculated total float, right? Total float is nothing but LST minus EST or LFT minus EFT. So free float is nothing but the portion of total float within which an activity can be manipulated without affecting the float of succeeding activities. So how you can determine? You can determine this by subtracting the head event slack from the total float of an activity. So I'll give it as a formula: free float for activity I to j is nothing but total float of the activity I to j minus slack of event j. So the free float basically indicates the value by which an activity in question can be delayed beyond the earliest starting point without affecting the earliest start, and therefore the total float of the activities following it. The next float what we should understand is independent float. So what is this independent float? Independent float is nothing but the portion of total float within which an activity can be delayed for start without affecting the float of preceding activities. So how it is computed? It is computed by subtracting the tail event slack from free float of an activity. So in the previous thing we have calculated the free float. So from free float you have to subtract the tail event slack. So independent float of an activity I to j is nothing but free flow of an activity I to j minus slack of event I. So this independent float is always either equal to or less than the free float of an activity, and if negative value is obtained then independent float is taken as 0. and you have one more float. We'll finish off with that. The other float is interfering float. So what is this interfering float? It is utilization of the float of an activity can affect the float of subsequent activities. If you are going to use the float of an activity, it will affect the float of subsequent activities in the network. So the interfering float can be defined as that part of total float which causes a reduction, in the float of the successor's activity. Because when you use the float, it will affect the float of subsequent activities. So this interfering float is something which can be defined as part of total float which causes reduction in the float of successor's activity. To put it in other words, it can be defined as difference between the latest finish time of the activity under consideration and the earliest starting time of the following activity, or 0, whichever is higher. So I'll repeat again. It can be defined as difference between the latest finish time of the activity under consideration and earliest start time of the following activity, or 0, whichever is higher. So interfering float refers to that portion of the activity float which cannot be consumed without affecting adversely the float of subsequent activity or activities.